We were just kind of going along the main bit of Oxford Circus in London. I suddenly realised that in front of me was someone with a poster and it had my name on it, on a very strange red high heel, and another poster that just said Marianna Spring is 25, and that was it. And I sort of got kind of hurried into an alley that was like, oh, probably shouldn't be standing by those people.
Marianna Spring, I pray for the day that you stood at Nuremberg.
Marianna Spring, hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Thank you very much for coming to our studio to give us a bit of your time and talk to us. Really appreciate it. You're the BBC's first disinformation and social media reporter. What does that work involve?
It mainly involves investigating the human cost of online conspiracies, disinformation, online abuse. Most recently, that's been about the pandemic, about vaccines, about the US election this time last year, and I've been doing a lot about trolls as of late because the reporting I do makes me a target for some really extreme abuse.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you just saying that then actually has reminded me. I saw a video at an anti-vax protest, and people are referring to you by name, and I found that utterly worrying, appalling, upsetting, really. I mean, yeah, to experience that is really tough. But you've got a Panorama documentary out about this. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so I investigated online hate that was being sent to me, but also being sent to a variety of different women, both in and out of the public eye, from Love Islanders to politicians to doctors. And as part of that, I wanted to test whether social media sites are promoting hate, because that's something they say they don't do, and particularly promoting hate to hateful accounts, to trolls. And so we set up this troll called Barry. Barry was based on accounts sending me abuse. Barry wasn't real. He was totally locked down. He wasn't sending out hate to women. He mainly engaged in anti-vax and conspiracy content, but a bit of misogyny too, so that he accurately reflected the account sending me abuse, and so that the social media sites could be aware of the fact that he was a troll. And what we found, particularly on Facebook and Instagram, is that he was just being pushed more and more misogynistic content, some really quite nasty stuff, memes about rape, harassment. When we told Facebook about Barry, they said to us that they try and tackle hate, that they put the safety of their community over profit. But it was really, really worrying to see. I think particularly because it made me realise how accounts sending me abuse could be emboldened to push out more hate to me and other women, because this kind of stuff is on their social media feeds. They're being suggested it, promoted it, whether that's pages or accounts in the case of Instagram. But also the harm that it actually causes to the Barrys, the people who are sucked into these actually really quite harmful ideologies. And it struck me that having spent the past year and a half covering anti-vax and conspiracy content, when we first logged on to Barry's account, even though I'd mainly liked that stuff, he didn't really have much of that stuff at all. And if they're able to deprioritise that kind of content and not send it to him, then why are they not able to do the same with anti-women content?
So that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about next, because there is this really grim undercurrent of misogyny, particularly actually in terms of the abuse that MPs receive. There's this really nasty gendered element to it. The way these social media platforms have very effectively identified COVID misinformation and applied proper labelling or deprioritising things in the newsfeed really, really significantly. We see it all the time in our content. If we do something that even makes a very mild reference to coronavirus, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube as well, will immediately apply proper tagging to it, sources to official authorities. So they have the technology and the ability to identify the subject matter of a piece of content, label it as such, and then redirect people to other places. So in my eyes, it kind of follows they should be able to do the same when it comes to misogyny and sexist abuse.
That is what you would think. And it is difficult because they've obviously come under huge amounts of pressure during the pandemic to do more about disinformation and conspiracy theories, because we've all been seeing the real world harm that they can have. And as that pressure has mounted, they've adapted policies, they've changed how they tackle this sort of stuff. But that same kind of pressure doesn't appear to have made a difference when it comes to hate targeting women. I had an expert who advised me on the experiment, Chloe Colliver from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, and she spoke a bit about why she thinks this is, and ultimately the business models of these social media sites, that extreme content, in this case anti-women, misogynistic content, will draw a user like Barry, and keep them engaged for longer. More engagement means that they can sell more ads, and that means more money. Again, Facebook says that it puts safety of community over profit, but it's very easy to see just through an experiment like that how you might question whether that's really the case.
You had a really eye-opening conversation as well with someone who actually abuses you. I mean, first of all, what are you thinking as that phone's ringing and you're about to have a chat with that person?
Yeah, so his name is Steve. He is from the Midlands. He's a van driver. And he wasn't one of the people that had sent me the worst abuse. So I think I was perhaps not as nervous as I thought I might have been. There were some other people who we were trying to get in contact with who scared me a little bit more. And luckily I was doing it from the safety of the troll den. So I felt really well protected by my lava lamp. It was really interesting, and actually it really upset me when I was trying to get in touch with some of the accounts sending me abuse. There was one that I tried to get in touch with, and he was actually a Spurs fan. I'm also a massive Spurs fan, and I was like, maybe we'll be able to talk about this. Maybe we'll be able to have a really positive conversation. Maybe we'll be able to go to the football together. He blocked me immediately, and I was really upset because I felt like, why are you allowed to just get away with this? You're allowed to send me this, and then you're allowed to run away and block me and remain on social media and send out hate to other women, other people, which was apparent from his feed. So I respected the fact that Steve actually agreed to speak to me. And I found the conversation really eye-opening. I don't think he fully understood the implications of the hate he'd sent me or that he admitted to sending to other people. But I do think that he'd started to realise how using social media had made him quite disinhibited in the way he was behaving, and that actually speaking to me, he would never have said the kinds of things that he had in his messages. And now he has actually stopped sending me hate. He unsent the hateful messages that he'd sent me on Facebook. He still sends me things telling me COVID isn't real. And he also told me, and climate change isn't real. And my favourite bit of that interview was when he told me that he receives abuse, which obviously is really rubbish. And I asked him about that, and he said, oh, it's from people that believe in 9/11 or think climate change is a thing. And I was like, oh, yeah. Slightly different. Yeah, a little. And the really revealing part of that conversation, or his part of the conversation anyway for me, was he used the word frustration. He said he gets frustrated from the type of people you're talking about, and then it's kind of an outlet, it's a vent for him. And I thought that was really interesting because it demonstrates it's a release valve for him, and he doesn't see you as a person at the other end. It's just an activity he can do to de-stress in sort of our world of social media. That's something that he views as a valid outlet, when obviously it's not. Completely, and I think that was his primary motivation. He was angry, he was frustrated, and I often say this when I talk about online hate because I expect to be challenged. In fact, I spend a lot of time interviewing people who believe very extreme online conspiracies because I want to understand what they believe, and I want to hear what they have to say, and I want to come from a point of empathy and understanding in the reporting that I do. And anyone challenging me or disagreeing with me is absolutely not a problem. The difficulty is when it starts to tip into this really nasty abuse, when people are threatening you with rape and death threats and really, really nasty stuff. And I think that Steve began to realise that what he was doing, and I think that it's just quite sad really. I mean, he said something that was too muffled for us to include at the time, which was effectively along the lines of, oh, I sort of wish I didn't use social media so much. Says a bloke who uses social media like 100 times a day, is posting on his wall all the time. And that really reminded me of this dual harm idea, this idea that obviously it's causing harm to the women being targeted, and that's, you know, the crucial part. But actually he's harmed too, and he's a victim in many ways, and he's being let down. And when I spoke to some MPs who are looking at online safety legislation and the proposed bill, and talking about online harm targeting women in particular, and they also spoke about this idea that actually, you know, there are a lot of people coming to harm, and this question of whether social media sites are honouring their duty of care to the Barrys, to the Steves, and to the women affected in this case.
I have a friend that says the easiest way, there's a very simple way to prevent online bullying and online abuse: log off. What do you make of that idea?
Something I've been told many a time, and it's very difficult when your job is investigating social media, because it's actually a vital tool for you to be able to do that. And so many of the women I spoke to raised this and said, oh, you know, people have told me just to log off or ignore it, or that I mustn't respond and I mustn't engage. And I think there's an argument for not, you know, engaging with every single person sending you these kinds of comments or adding fuel to the fire, but actually, you know, being anyone who has a job, or particularly someone in public life, social media is really important. And if women feel like they can't use social media to do their jobs, and as part of that, they're hugely disadvantaged. And it's a topic that came up quite a few times, particularly when I was interviewing female politicians who were worried about the freedom of speech of women themselves. And that's an argument that comes up a lot when we talk about this, the issue that could it inhibit freedom of speech if there are more restrictions on what people can or can't post online? You know, does talking about online hate stifle debate? Does that mean that people actually can't disagree with each other? But all of the women I interviewed are talking about, you know, awful gendered slurs, racist abuse, death threats, hate that they just think they shouldn't have to put up with, and they also shouldn't have to quietly put up with, as though it's normal. And I think when I was first getting hate, I remember calling up my editor. I was covering the q-anon conspiracy, which is the baseless conspiracy that Donald Trump is waging a secret war against satanic paedophiles, very powerful satanic paedophiles. And I remember having my first sort of pile-on from conspiracy activists, and I called up my editor, and I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. trying to block all these accounts because you just couldn't stop it. It was like trying to stem this leak. I couldn't stop it, and I also was incapable of disengaging with it. And he's brilliant and super supportive. But I very much was of the opinion that this is really not normal. Why do we think this is okay and that we should all have to put up with this? You know, this shouldn't be part and parcel of doing your job. And that is just something that came up time and time again from doctors to Love Islanders who said, you know, this is my workplace. I have to use this. I use this as an extension of what I do. Why should I be targeted with hate in this way?
Okay, let's talk about conspiracy theories, and I'm glad you mentioned QAnon because I want to come back to it. But just briefly, and I guess it relates to abuse as well in relation to social media companies, how culpable do you think they are for the content that's hosted on their platforms?
I've spent the past now nearly 2 years covering the casualties, the victims of online conspiracies and disinformation. And you spend a lot of time, you know, speaking to people on the phone or on Zoom, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, but actually meeting people and talking to them and understanding what's happened to them. And the common theme is that what they are seeing on social media has had a really negative impact on their lives. It might have destroyed their relationships, it might have provoked violence, it might have caused them to think COVID wasn't real or not get a vaccine. And I think, to answer your question, that actually, you know, my reporting just highlights again and again the role that social media plays in that. And you see how policies change and there is action taken, but it tends to be after the victims of harm are exposed, and those lives are already affected, they're lost. I remember last year I covered this story of this guy called Brian whose wife died of COVID after they both thought that COVID wasn't real, it wasn't that serious, having seen stuff on Facebook. Facebook again said that it was doing everything it could to protect people from online disinformation. But I called Brian at the very end of the year for this end of year roundup, and it was his birthday. And, you know, it was just, no policy change brings his wife back. And that's really, really sad.
Yeah, it is really sad. You're right. Okay, QAnon. What the fuck is that all about? I mean, please. Because, you know, I pay attention to it a bit. I try to understand it, but it's deep. There's a lot there, and you are an expert in it. So please, you know, try and give us the cliff notes of what the QAnon conspiracy theory is about. So
I have my ready-made phrase, which I always use, but perhaps people are like, "What on earth is she talking about?" Which is, at its heart, it's this belief that Trump is waging this secret war and that there are satanic paedophiles who are in government, in business, in media, who are running everything. And it began after the 2016 election. It was a conspiracy that sprung up on the fringes of the internet and then found its way into the mainstream, and actually has been very good at rebranding itself. So we saw before the US election last year, they started using terms like save the children, save our children, to make this conspiracy more palatable and actually reach more people. And you saw how particularly a lot of younger women and parents were then being drawn into this very powerful motif of child abuse, which obviously is horrific, but that was being misappropriated in order to promote political disinformation. I think the important thing about QAnon, and in many ways it's very, very similar to all kinds of conspiracy movements and mentalities, is the ability it has to sow seeds of doubt so that people no longer trust anything, and it plays into that distrust, and it then becomes a vehicle to promote harmful and false views, because people, they don't trust anything. And often people have very legitimate reasons for not trusting institutions or politicians or all kinds of different people, but they are then being conned by someone else rather than actually being saved, which a lot of them think. And we saw with QAnon, I did quite a lot of reporting this time last year, start of this year, when obviously we saw the riots at Capitol Hill, about how QAnon, you know, laid the groundwork for what happened there, and a lot of the kind of QAnon influencers were pictured at Capitol Hill, and I think people often think of it quite rightly as this very quirky, very strange conspiracy view, and when you get into it, it's really hard to understand why or how people would believe it. I remember covering this Wayfair conspiracy, I don't know if you heard about this at the time, which was they believed that Wayfair was abducting kids and selling them in cupboards.
The furniture manufacturer.
Yeah. Because the cupboards had girls' names and various other things. And I remember covering it. I actually remember telling my mum about it. My mum being like, "What?" My mum also always calls it q-anon, which is quite funny. But actually, it runs deeper than that, and we all get a little bit caught up in the bonkers, bizarre, funny bits of it. But the really worrying bit is the ability it has to erode trust, and what that can do, you know, in the case of what we saw happen in the States, promote violence. But it's not limited to the States, and in many ways that mentality has been exported elsewhere, particularly during the pandemic, when people are frightened, distrustful, and willing to believe that there are lots of bad people trying to do bad stuff to them.
I'm so glad you said that, because we were at an anti-vax march in the summer reporting there, and we found a fully paid up QAnon guy, you know, where we go, one we go all t-shirt, I believe in Q, blah, 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 blah. And I first of all thought it was isolated to America, realised it's not. And again, it relates to the point you were just making, that the general erosion of trust then feeds into perhaps something like being an anti-vaxxer. To what extent is there a degree of overlap between people who believe in these conspiracy theories? Because you kind of think that perhaps some of their ecosystems are quite separate, or they have like opposing beliefs, but in actual fact, there's quite a lot of overlap, isn't there?
There is, and it always really interests me how people, particularly who sit on kind of either end of the political spectrum, can find themselves equally falling victim to these kinds of conspiracies. The common theme is that they tend to be people who distrust the system, who the system has not benefited, and so it's very easy to understand how you can be drawn into that kind of conspiracy worldview, particularly when you're seeing this stuff on your social media feed again and again and again repeatedly. And I think actually there's a lot of overlap, because you know, all of these conspiracies at their heart are about thinking that there are shady, sinister plots to control people, to harm people, to hurt them, because people are deeply distrustful, and because they've had bad experiences, and because of all kinds of different reasons. But unfortunately, that then goes on to cause harm, whether it, you know, entirely misleads them, it impacts democracy, it impacts their lives or their relationships. It's a really, really bad thing. And I was just thinking actually about at rallies the kinds of people that you meet, because I've covered quite a few of the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine rallies that have become kind of increasingly muddled with extreme conspiracies, but like you say, also, you know, QAnon and conspiracies exported from the US that seem actually really different. And you see people with, you know, the where we go, one we go all t-shirts and stuff like that. And I remember just after the first lockdown last year, I was outside Buckingham Palace, and there were a group of women who were from London, never been to the States, who were protesting. And they were kind of an offshoot of the anti-lockdown rally that was happening in Trafalgar Square. And I was talking to this woman, and she was really nice, and she was telling me how she was going to go and get a Tesco meal deal after we chatted, and you know, having this fairly normal conversation. And I started to ask her about her poster, which had where we go, one we go all. And I said, well, do you like Donald Trump? Do you know what QAnon is? She said, oh yeah, no, I'm actually really into QAnon, yeah. I don't really like Donald Trump very much, but I was kind of like, okay. And she said, well, you do know what's going on, don't you? And I said, what do you think is going on? And she just looked down at the floor and said, under our feet right now, there are babies in tunnels waiting to be eaten by Prince Charles. And I just kind of, like, oh, right, where did you hear that? And she said, oh, I just pop it into YouTube, really, like babies, tunnels. And I kind of thought, oh my gosh, obviously that is not true. Not that I've replied Prince Charles about that. But it does just strike you how, and then in the next breath she was talking about normal stuff, how it was quite sunny, and how she was really excited at being able to go out to, I think it was just when the UK was sort of opening up again and doing fun stuff. And you just think, how has this happened? Because can you not hear what you're saying to me?
Yeah, we'll come to talking about how you maybe help someone leave, that kind of idea. But just quickly, is it quite dangerous for you to go to these sort of anti-vax, anti-lockdown protests? Because, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, like, you're recognisable and a lot of your work is done combating the disinformation that's being put out there, so that makes you perhaps not a very likeable person in those circles.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're my biggest fan, but I think it's really important to be able to go to these protests, because it's only in attending them that you can understand what people think. I did a film for Newsnight in the summer where I followed two protesters who were going to a rally in London and interviewed them. They were kind of sat on either side of the political spectrum. One was from Darlington, the other was from Milton Keynes. They were really, really interesting, and the only way of actually investigating and exposing these conspiracy movements and how they work and the harm they can cause is meeting people and understanding them. But it obviously does come with that risk. There was one rally I was covering, it was for Newsnight actually, and we were just kind of going along the main bit of Oxford Circus in London, down Oxford Street, and suddenly realised that in front of me was someone with a poster and it had my name on it on a very strange red high heel, and another poster that just said Marianna Spring is 25, and that was it. And I sort of got kind of hurried into an alley that was like, oh, we probably shouldn't be standing by those people. And obviously, the BBC is brilliant at making sure that I feel really safe at those rallies. You have a great team of producers and security advisors and other people who make sure you're safe. But it does come with a risk, and it's quite frustrating actually, because a lot of these people are, I think, in many ways, again, kind of victims of these conspiracy movements, but they can be very, very hostile, and you have to be prepared for that, particularly because these rallies can often actually, get quite aggressive, and we've seen that happen. And this radicalisation to violence, effectively, that's been happening in this movement, where people are calling for executions and hangings. I mean, beside the posters about me, there was one about hanging various cabinet ministers and stuff like that. Very different from just saying, actually, I really don't agree with the government.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think a lot of people will be in the situation where they either have close friends or family who maybe, not necessarily full-on QAnon, but vaccine hesitancy, vaccine skepticism, someone who's been subject of unfortunate disinformation or perhaps conspiracy theories. What's the approach that someone should take to trying to help that person, or inform them of other ideas? What should they do to try and help?
I've had loads of people get in touch with me who ask me this, who have everyone from a cousin or a best friend or an auntie or a mum to a grandparent to a kid who have become really involved in online conspiracies, particularly during the pandemic, but often who are now pivoting to other forms of disinformation about climate change or about elections or stuff like that. And I think some of the best advice I've actually had about this is from people who've been impacted by it personally. So I interviewed the son of one of the UK's leading conspiracy influencers, Kate Shemarani. His name is Sebastian. And he said that something he found really effective was to question the conspiracy itself, that obviously, facts are important and you want to give people correct information, but to actually ask someone, why do you think that? Or how would that work? Why would someone be trying to do this? And I think that can be the most revealing. And I kind of gave it a shot myself at a rally once. And I asked a very nice guy who was chatting to me with his Bill Gates is trying to kill us all with the vaccine, not true, on his placard. I asked him, why would he want to do that? What does he seek to gain? I don't understand. And he looked me dead in the eye and just said, you clearly think most people are good, and I think almost everyone is bad, because almost everyone has been bad to me. And it's really hard to combat that, because you think, wow, I'm not going to be able to repair that distrust, and I don't know who is. But I think if you can start to understand why someone is believing this stuff, it's helpful. Another woman I interviewed who used to be an anti-vaxxer and rejected that mentality said that for her it was actually realising that doing your own research, which is one of the favourite conspiracy phrases, involves interrogating all sides, and that you might be being conned by someone else when you're trying to escape being conned by, in her case, she thought she was being conned by politicians and institutions because she'd had legitimate bad experiences, but then was being conned by, various social media influencers who were telling her the vaccine wasn't safe. And so actually being able to, have some agency, absolutely do your own research, absolutely look into stuff, and, think about trust and why you don't trust something and why you do. And I think if you can start to understand that, and particularly as well, I think that when it's your close family member or one of your best friends, you're sometimes the best vessel for communicating with them, because there might not be many people they trust, but you hope that they might trust you. And so if you can at least start to have those conversations, and it might not be quick and it might not be easy, and that's something that comes up a lot, that actually it requires a sustained kind of set of conversations about this to really help someone and to really empathise and understand. But actually having a blazing row doesn't tend to be very effective, and it can often push people further down the rabbit hole.
The sad thing is it often starts with a kernel of truth or a misgiving or a distrust of someone, whether it's a politician, the media or whatever, that then spirals into outright disinformation. It's difficult when it starts from a legitimate place like that. Marianna Spring, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Cheers.
Thanks for speaking to me.